white, black, light, dark, 1, 0, devil, angel. What do all of these have in common? The answer is that they are pairs of opposites, things that are contrary to one or the others. Light, which brings sight and awareness, is the antithesis of its absence, which blinds and obfuscates, where black is the warm embrace and gentle presence compared to a sickly, thought-killing white. The something of one, the nothing of zero, as well as the free devils that yearn for their shackled brothers to join them. All of these are opposites of one another. But this video is not about opposites. This video is about how you arrived at that conclusion. This video is about patterns, taking the information you have and reaching the logical conclusion it leads to. But with patterns comes assumptions. With logic, there are fallacies. With 1 and 0, we fail to consider 2, or 3, or 7. At some point, we need to ask, are we applying patterns to things that don't necessarily follow it? With black and white, there are shades of nuanced gray, not even considering yellow and red. Then there is the age-old question of who was first. Hi, I'm Dante. Sorry for interrupting my own complicated, thought-provoking video essay intro that doesn't seem to be related to anything I'm talking about until you realize halfway through the video intro. But I am pressed for time. So, Deltarune, you know, that game, the game that's coming out tomorrow, the game that's been coming out tomorrow for the past month, that game. The good news is that Deltarune has been progressing smoothly these past months, and Toby has been far more active on Biscuit, showing more and more that Deltarune is arriving eminently. Whether that means tomorrow or April or 3 seconds is unclear. So much so that I'm actually kind of scared to make this video because I fear that it might immediately be outdated 3 seconds later. This, however, is what I like to call a coward's mentality. So I'm taking the risk anyway. Regardless, something has been brought up to my attention that I sort of need to talk about. A revelation from the divine. A prophecy told from time and space or something. Something that has appeared in my radar at the last moment. And it started with the Queen fight. When Birdley is about to open the Dark Fountain, Rousey stops him, explaining that if he does open a Dark Fountain here, then the balance between light and dark will be broken. The shadows will subsume the light, the fountain will fill the skies. All will fall to chaos as the titans form from the fountains. The surviving darkness will turn to stone, and the lightners will be lost forever in the night. But I'm not talking about the roaring. I'm talking about what happens immediately after this scene. Throughout Chapter 2, we see Queen talking about her plans and what she wants to do. She really just seems to want to make everybody happy, and is willing to become a tyrant to do that. If this is what she wants, then why does she want to cause the roaring? Because she didn't know it would do that. Queen admits that she never actually met the knight, that she was only basing her plans on the knight's actions. She didn't know what the roaring was, and when she figured out, she quit her plans and let the heroes close the fountain. A governing figure that realizes her mistake when told factual information. Unrealistic. I guess it goes to show you can't trust everything you read on the internet, but regardless, we saved the day. It was all one big miscommunication. But thankfully we have Rousey to tell us the truth behind the roaring, like the prophecy. Thankfully Rousey is an unbiased pieces of information and the primary source for all our questions. Thankfully Rousey knows everything. Hey, wait a minute. Deltarune, and by extension, Undertale, has garnered a reputation for its theories. Some people say that this can be unwarranted, when some theories can be pretty out there. And while there may be situations where people are overthinking details that may or may not actually matter, or just straight up make things up, that being said, the theory community of Deltarune is entirely justified. For starters, we got this pervert. Pretty much the face of video game secrets at this point. Everything surrounding him is also an important factor. If we aren't even talking about the stuff that's in the code, then there are some unanswered questions that still linger in the air. Deltarune also has a bunch of things. A game that has put a lot of emphasis on rewarding backtracking or finding glitches and Easter eggs. A game that has so much for you to discover so long as you turn around and dig. Even without all of those, characters in this game have these incredibly subtle moments that emphasize the fact that there is so much more beneath the surface. Deltarune and theory crafting don't just go hand in hand. The two are necessities that exist together. You are supposed to turn around. You are supposed to read the hint. You're supposed to ask, hey, what if, and use that question to find something you didn't know was possible. Deltarune is a game about patterns, and I'm not just talking about motifs. I mean narrative patterns, symbolic patterns, familial and metaphorical patterns. But at the same time, we only got 2 sevenths of the game. Every pattern we may have caught onto could be completely derailed because we failed to consider something. At least it was better than what we had at Chapter 1, because back then the main theory was Chris was going to pull the Jelf the Killer and Jelf the Kill people. But that's mainly because we only had the framework of Undertale to work with. And, to be completely fair, we may have not been that far off. The point I'm trying to make is that while we only had so much in Chapter 1, Chapter 2 gave us a lot more to work with, to really solidify our ideas. So then Chapter 3 and 4 will either confirm or redirect our patterns. But until then, the only patterns we can trust are the ones that we can confirm ourselves. Until then, we are working off of incomplete information. We are just like Queen, basing everything we believe on the knight's actions. Which leads us to Rousey, the boy who knows so much about this, yet is so specific with what he tells us and when. Where did you get this information, Rouse? How much do you know, Raisley? Tell me your secrets, you gay little wizard! If you'll allow me to chill for a moment, I've talked about stuff like this in my Rousey analysis, so if you want 2 hours of me talking about this, go check the description and like and subscribe or whatever. How much do we know for a fact that everything Rousey tells us is 100% accurate? How much do we know that these are the unbiased truths, and not something that Rousey is assuming to be correct? The answer? We don't know. And that's the problem. We should be able to trust Rousey unconditionally, but we also thought Queen knew everything she was doing. So I hope you excuse me, but I'm going to extend that logic over to Rousey. Make the assumption that, while he definitely knows more than everyone, there are gaps that he may be unaware of. Which, by the way, is not me saying, he's lying, he's evil, throw him in a river of acid. I believe in the prophecy. I believe that the roaring is something that can happen, and it will be bad. But there might be something we are missing. Something we failed to consider. But talking about the roaring is its own theological debate. So let's talk about somebody else. The Knight. There are many speculations of who the Knight is, whether it's Alpine, or Geyser, or Seymour Butts, or literally everyone in town for some reason. To save some time, I won't be talking about who I think the Knight is. because I've made my stance abundantly clear before. But regardless, I want to talk about the nature of the night and what's the night's motive. Why? Because it's obvious. The queen called the night the roaring night, so obviously the night wants to roar all over the light world, because that's what the queen says.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
Now here's the important thing. Can we be sure that the night wants to cause the roaring? Actually, we can. Let's do a little thought experiment. Burley was about to open a dark fountain before being stopped by Rousey. Then Rousey says that if he does, it would cause the roaring. Let's piece this together. If a dark fountain was opened in a dark world, the roaring would happen. Hell, why not even that? It might just be a total of 3 dark fountains. The cutscenes show 3 fountains, so that might be the number that tips the scale. 1 is good, 2 is teetering, and 3 is knocked over. So if the night wanted to cause the roaring, all they needed to do was to open 2 dark fountains before they closed the 3rd one. Congratulations, Night, your job is so easy. Notice how I said the word if, cause the roaring hasn't happened yet. I mean, you could make the argument that the Night can't open more than 1 fountain at a time, or is too tired to, but that's an assumption. There's nothing really implying that, other than the night only opening 1 fountain at a time, which could also just as much imply that the night has other motives too. So what other motives are there? We don't know. We can think of others, and people have thought about a bunch of others that aren't roaring adjacent. However, we are only working with incomplete information. Until the night literally carves this out for us, we can't know for sure. So simply saying that the night wants to end the world when the only evidence supporting that is an adjective from someone who admits she never met the night, excuse me for saying this, but I think I have reasonable suspicion to doubt that. Now, the question then becomes, why does the queen refer to the night as the roaring night then? To that, I have no explanation. Maybe it's the dark world creating details through queen, maybe it's the will of the fountain from the night, so maybe the night actually does want to cause a roaring then? The point I'm trying to make is that we can't know for certain. Maybe the night is opening fountains to create adventures and leveling up. Maybe the night is using the fountains to gain new friends. Maybe the night is trying to find someone trapped in the dark. Maybe it's a combination of all 3 of these things. Now, you may have just noticed what I did. When it came to the prophecy and the roaring, I trusted, at least, that part was true. When it came to the night's motive, I expressed doubts of my statement. Why do I trust one thing and not the others? Well, for starters, we have nothing really pointing to the prophecy being bullshit. Even if you have a gut feeling that the prophecy is a lie, you have to admit that that is all you have. It's one thing to have doubts. It's another thing to justify those doubts. You're still free to believe, go on ahead, just tread cautiously with that belief. Because at some point, there is a line between having doubts and calling every evidence that disagrees with you a red herring to the point that the term stops having meaning anymore. Misdirection is best when used to serve a point. So it could be that both are true, both are false, or even the opposite of what I believe is true. But enough rambling about nuance. We're Deltarune fans. We hate nuance. I want you to tell me how wrong I am. Alright. Let's move on to the next topic. What's the fucking deal with Chris and Rousey? For anyone who has been living under a rock, got any room for me? I mean, T-theory is a theory analysis that suggests that the amount of health you get from a specific type of tea from this Addison correlates to the feeling and emotions resonated between those 2 characters. Take Susie for example. She gains a full 120 HP from everyone. She wears her love on her chest. At least to us. Now to Rousey. Chris and Susie are his best friends, but Noelle is a bit of a stranger to him. Speaking of Noelle, she's medically barred from drinking Susie tea as to not drown herself, so Chris tea will suffice. Rousey tea isn't too special to her because at that point, they had never met. As for our good old Christian dreamer, Susie T is great to them, which makes sense because they did always have a soft spot for her. Noelle T, however, is lesser, and for Rousey T, not much either. Hi there, it's me, Dante. So, something very funny just happened. You know, I mentioned that Toby has been posting a lot on Blusky, so he posted a fun fact about how once the chapter ends, all Ts become rotten tea, and only give 10 HP, causing tea holders to enter financial ruin. Well, that sucks. Looks like we now have to rely on our analytical skills to determine a character's feeling towards each other. I still think it's canon for Chapter 2, but we can't game the system anymore. Anyway, Dante out. Chris and Noelle are interesting, since they used to be childhood friends. Chris, Noelle, Azzy, and Des used to hang out a lot in the past. But that was the past. It appears that something has caused that friendship to falter. But that's not the conclusion everybody draws. Instead, they draw the conclusion that Chris hates Rousey, and there's no other explanation other than Chris wanting to throw Rousey in an oven. But if we really want to take an objective look at the clues we are given, that's a bit of a leap in logic. Even if Rousey and Noelle are strangers, they still get 50 HP from each other's tea. Chris gets 60 HP, which means that Rousey is above the standing of a complete stranger. Congratulations! Plus, if we really wanted to extend that logic, if Chris disliked Rousey, the tea would have been 40 or 20 or 0. Hell, if Chris hated Rousey, as people say, it would hurt Chris every time they drank it. It could just be that Chris isn't as close to Rousey. The two did just meet yesterday. While so did Susie and Rousey, the thing is that Rousey has brought Susie an entire character arc. So, of course she's going to be grateful for Rousey. So, yes, the reason why the Rousey is so low is because they just aren't that close. At least, that's the safe assumption. There's another way this could be interpreted. One that also lines up with why Noelle is lower too, despite them both being childhood friends. The two used to be close, but ever since something happened, they aren't as close anymore. I think it's not something simple as a waning friendship that's the reason Noelle's so low. I think Chris's feelings towards Noelle are a bit more complicated than just like or dislike. For starters, there's Noelle's seemingly absent sister. There's Chris's father, who used to be the police chief, who now no longer holds that position. Then there's the mention of an incident between Chris and this bunker. All of these point to something happening in the past. Something that Chris might feel guilty about. And that's why I think Noelle T is slow for Chris. So to circle back to Rousey, it could just be that Chris does like Rousey too, but the feelings may be a bit more complicated than just like or dislike. People have speculated that Rousey might be the red horns Chris used to wear, so could Rousey be a more idealized version of Chris? I think it would kind of sting to see a more idealized version of yourself just waltzing about, regardless of how likable they are. But there is a reverse side to this. Darkeners are objects, and Chris knows that. They carry them from the abandoned classroom to the storage closet. So even if Rousey is or is not the red horns, that does not matter. Because no matter how fluffy and cute or adorable Rousey is, that is not a person. He's just an object to be used for a purpose. No matter how successful Rousey is at appeasing Chris, Chris just can't see Rousey as any more than the object that he is. To conclude this section, Chris either sees Rousey as an idealized version of themselves and feels jealous of them, even if Rousey's kindness is genuine, or no matter how much Rousey tries and succeeds to appease Chris, Chris knows that Rousey is not a real person and just can't empathize with them. Envy or apathy? Pick your flavor of Kraus angst in the comments below. For being the very first major boss in the game, King really doesn't have a lot of presence. Which makes sense, since he only shows up at the end of Chapter 1, and the one who's been antagonizing us the most was his son, Lancer. Hell, for even after Chapter 1, most of the fan content was shifted towards Jevil. With the very little screen time King has, it's understandable why people don't tend to focus on him as much, so that people don't analyze him as much as the others. As such, there are a lot of assumptions that are only based on half memories of things somewhat touched upon. For that, let's talk about the bare basics of the texts we already know. There are 4 main kings of Card Castle. Lightners tend to visit Card Castle a lot, and use them to fulfill their purpose. Then one day, the Lightners stopped coming, and sometime afterwards, a strange night appeared, and 3 kings were thrown in the dungeon. Now that the fountains had started flowing, Spade King put him and his son into power, all to lead the charge against the Lightners by the Knight's will. Cool story, bro. You basically got abandonment issues after the classroom was locked up and made that the entire kingdom's problem. So the story seems straightforward. King got empowered by the Knight, and is now the Knight's puppet. There's no other way this could be interpreted, and anything I say is just overcomplicating an incredibly simple story. In that case, I won't say anything. I'll let Toby do the talking.
I don't know, I just want to believe that, like, Lancer had a really nice dad earlier, and you had, I don't know, he's got a nice dad, right?
I mean, I think that fountain definitely changed his behavior. For sure.
That's right, we're circling back to talking about dark fountains. So what we have from the word of Dog himself is that the dark fountains is what really causing the king to act the way he was. His proximity to the fountain really emphasized his aggressiveness, and after we seal the dark fountain and King goes to prison, he seems to be a lot more docile than what he was before. Still cutting insults, yes, but I think this is more in line with what his personality was before the fountain. Even Queen was said to be a bit nicer before, then the Dark Fountain came around, and she went into overdrive. If anything, I think it goes deeper. Ralsei mentions that if the roaring were to occur, titans would form from the fountains, causing darkness to fill the skies. Which makes me wonder, instead of the Knight being someone who is puppeteering the rulers of the Dark World, we are now presented with the possibility that it's really the darkness itself that's causing them to act this way. The Titan's words of annihilation whispered through the fountains. The Knight is the one opening them, but for all intents and purposes, their motivation does not matter. It's the will of the fountain affecting them. However, they see the Knight opening the fountain and think that the thoughts they have are part of the Knight's will, the same way people say their actions are by God's will, and make the assumption that the motivations and the ambition that they feel are what the Knight wants, when in reality, their motivations come from something darker yet darker. At least this is all under the assumption that the Knight is not just the one controlling King and Queen, which could easily be the case. It's hard sometimes to take a step back and really take into account the assumptions one makes, because we are humans. Humans are pattern-making machines. We look at something and wish to see the connections with the things all around them. Black and white, 1 and 0, light and dark. There are only so many angelic ideas, but the devil is in the details. So when things don't follow the patterns we are expecting, people will so readily dismiss it. All of that on the segment of regarding the Dark Fountain is based on the idea that what we are told is not the case. And even if I have good reason to, there's a chance that this is just me dismissing the idea, as well as a major detail that none of us have noticed. Being skeptical is usually a good idea, but at what point are we just blindly turning away from something that is absolutely the truth for no reason other than, hey, wouldn't it be cool if? In fact, something like that happened with me recently. I was originally going to include a segment on Chris specifically, what they do, between chapters. And I don't mean between chapter 1 and 2. I mean when you open a chapter 2 save file that is not linked with the previous chapter 1 save file. Stuff like Ralsei having the white ribbons. Because I heard somewhere that Chris tells Undyne about the dark fountains in chapter 1, regardless if you are present. Onion Song gets missed, talking to Noelle gets missed, so why was this the one thing that happens? Because it doesn't. When an event happens in a save file, the line that event happens gets overwritten. So if the game wants to check to see if something happened in the past, it will check that line. When a new save file is made for chapter 2, all events are blanked. Nothing gets inherited because nothing happened. So Chris doesn't tell Undyne between chapters. So someone was spreading false information. So we can say for certain that the one canonical thing that happens in chapter 1 is Chris giving Ralsei the white ribbons. And even then, the check for that event is unmarked, so the white ribbons just manifested in Ralsei's inventory. Fate hath decreed that Ralsei must be pretty boy. That's the thing about theory crafting. Sometimes you're onto something, sometimes you're delusional. I was delusional. With that in mind, I suppose I come with one final takeaway. Look carefully. Not closely, carefully. Don't just gather all the details. Really consider them and what they really mean. And consider all outcomes. Because there may just be a major truth that you easily dismissed because you thought it was not possible, when it very much is. When you're taking all the details into account, ask yourself, are you being fair in your assessment? Are you giving all the details the care and attention that they need? Or are you glancing over them and calling them red herrings? Or are you putting too much focus on something that may or may not actually matter? Do you already have an idea that isn't as supported as much as you thought? And are you willing to change your opinions when faced with something undeniable? 'Cause, believe it or not, admitting you are wrong is actually a pretty cool thing to do. So, look carefully, don't easily dismiss all outcomes, consider with caution, and understand, when you're working with incomplete information, pattern recognition is a double-edged sword.